You know, when you think about the global race for rare earths, you probably picture these giant mines, right? Huge trucks, massive holes in the ground. But here's the thing, that picture, it's kind of wrong. The real fight, the place where dominance in this critical industry is actually decided, well, it doesn't happen in the dirt, it happens in the lab.
Yeah, this quote, it just nails it, doesn't it? Getting these elements out of the ground is really just the opening act. The true industrial challenge, the real hard part, where expertise is built and leaders are made, is in the incredibly complex chemistry that has to happen next.
All right, so here's how we're gonna break this down. First, we'll get into the core chemical problem itself. Then, we'll look at how China basically set the global standard. After that, we'll examine the very different uphill battle Western companies are facing, quantify just how big that gap really is, and finally, wrap our heads around what this new kind of industrial power actually looks like.
Okay, so first up, let's get to the heart of it. This entire industry pivots on one central process. It's a pretty complex field called hydrometallurgy. Think about it like this. You've got 17 rare earth elements that are chemically like almost identical twins. Trying to pick one out from the others in a huge crowd is, well, it's a nightmare. Solvent extraction is the massive industrial-scale process designed to do exactly that. It uses literally thousands of tanks all linked together to painstakingly tease these elements apart. And this chemical separation, not the mining, is the absolute bottleneck for the entire supply chain.
And this vitamins analogy is perfect. It really drives home why mastering that chemistry is so incredibly important. We're not talking about bulk stuff like iron ore. We're talking about tiny, irreplaceable ingredients that are absolutely essential for things like high-performance EV motors, wind turbines, and even advanced defense systems. Because without that super complex separation, all you've got is a bucket of expensive, useless dirt.
All right, now let's talk about China, because honestly, they wrote the playbook on this stuff. We're gonna look at Baotou in Inner Mongolia, which is ground zero for the global gold standard in rare earth separation. It's the benchmark everyone else is judged by.
So get this, their recovery rate for neodymium, one of the most valuable rare earths, over 95%. That is just incredibly efficient. It means for every bit of valuable material they put into their system, almost all of it comes out as a usable product. Almost nothing gets wasted. And it's not just about getting it out. The stuff they produce is 99.9% pure. We're talking about oxides so clean, they can go straight from the separation plant into making high-performance magnets. No extra costly purification steps needed. That's a sign of total mastery over the chemistry.
So how do they do it? Well, one of their secrets is processing these insanely concentrated solutions. 46,000 milligrams per liter. That's a technical way of saying they pack way more material into every single drop of liquid they process. It's a huge technical achievement that means more output from a smaller factory with lower costs. You get the picture.
And look, this didn't just happen by luck. This is the payoff from decades of relentless optimization. They've perfected their chemical recipes, they've engineered the fluid dynamics in their machinery down to a science, and they've built systems so tough they can take dirty raw materials or even old recycled magnets and still crank out a super pure product. It's a whole different level.
Okay, so that's the benchmark. Now, let's look at the West's attempt to catch up. And what you'll see is, well, they're playing a totally different game, with a completely different set of rules and challenges that their Chinese competitors just don't have to worry about.
Let's start with MP Materials in the US. Their first big hurdle happens before they even get to the fancy chemistry. It's in a process called beneficiation, which is basically just upgrading the raw ore to make it usable. And right there, in that first step, they lose about 10% of the valuable rare earths. It's just gone before the real work even starts.
And this slide really gets to a core difference in philosophy. MP Materials, to meet really high environmental standards, has to internalize a ton of costs. Like, they have to build and run their own separate facility just to make the chemicals they need for processing. China's state-owned giants? Nope. They just buy those same chemicals, cheap, from a massive state-backed industrial park right next door. It creates a fundamentally different and much higher cost floor for the American operation from day one.
Then you've got Lynas, the big Australian player. For them, it's all about what you could call a logistical tax. They dig up some of the best ore in the world in Australia, and then they have to dry it, pack it up, and ship it thousands of miles away to Malaysia to do the final separation. Every one of those steps, the shipping, the reprocessing, the handling, adds cost and complexity that just doesn't exist in China's all-in-one integrated model.
So let's pull all of this together and really look at the gap we're talking about.
Because it's not just about who's cheaper, it's about a fundamental difference in industrial power.
This table right here lays it all out so clearly. You've got three totally different models. China's is this massive, integrated, flexible beast. MP Materials in the US is built to be self-sufficient and super clean. And Linus is spread out across the globe to handle political risk. These aren't just small differences, they're fundamentally different industrial philosophies. And that creates this huge asymmetric advantage for China's hyper-efficient system.
So, what's the bottom line here? What does this all really mean? Well, China's dominance in rare earths isn't a story about having the best rocks or the cheapest labor. It's a story about mastering something that is way, way harder to copy.
You know, this kind of expertise doesn't just happen. It was built deliberately, brick by brick, over 40 years. We're talking about decades of focused, state-funded R&D and constant, on-the-ground, iterative improvement. While the West was basically getting out of this business, China was working to perfect it on a massive scale.
And this quote really says it all, doesn't it? The competition isn't against a country with a lot of mines. No. It's a competition against a deeply mature, scientifically advanced, and now digitally optimized industrial machine. It's a triumph of pure chemical engineering.
Okay, so let's get right into it. The secret isn't just about digging stuff up. No, the real advantage, the actual game-changing secret weapon in this whole global competition, it all comes down to something way more complex and, way more interesting. The chemistry of turning messy, complicated rocks into super high-tech materials. So it all starts with the raw material itself, what the engineers call the feedstock. And this is where you see this huge split in strategy, this real battle between two totally opposite philosophies. One that's all about purity, and another that, well, it absolutely thrives on chaos. So on one hand, look at the typical Chinese feedstock. It's a chemically chaotic, messy jumble of all these different minerals like bastanite and monazite all mixed in together. Now, compare that to the Western approach. They much prefer these really clean, really pure single mineral deposits. And this one fundamental difference, well, that's where our whole story really begins. So what are we even talking about with feedstock complexity? Well, this right here is the heart of the technical challenge. See, these rare earth minerals aren't just sitting next to each other in the rock. They are chemically bound together, and they're often stuck with radioactive elements like thorium. Trying to pull them apart is a massive, massive chemical engineering headache. And this is where China's strategy gets just absolutely fascinating. Instead of seeing all this complexity as a problem, something to avoid, they just leaned right into it. They built an industrial system that basically acts as a universal sink, and they turned a huge geological bug into their single greatest competitive feature. And this quote just nails it, doesn't it? This was not an accident. It was a deliberate, long-term industrial play. They took the thing that everyone else thought was a flaw, that messy, mixed-up ore, and they engineered a whole system that could not only handle it, but actually profit from it. So, how do they pull it off? Well, it's this super aggressive, multi-step chemical process. First, they take that mixed ore and they roast it with sulfuric acid at these blistering hot temperatures to literally crack the minerals open. Then, they use a leaching process to pull out the rare earths. But, and this is the genius part, their system is designed to then go in and sequentially separate out everything else, not as waste, but as valuable byproducts. So the crucial takeaway here is that this isn't about some single magic formula. The true innovation is something the source material calls IP tolerance. It's the deep, deep intellectual property, the hard-won operational know-how to manage the incredibly corrosive and radioactive side effects that all this messy chemistry kicks out. And having that expertise, it unlocks their entire strategy. It lets them act as this universal sink, taking in all kinds of different ore from third-party suppliers. They can just blend these totally inconsistent feeds into their giant processing circuits, and they use sheer scale and chemical force to smooth out all the differences. And maybe best of all, they get to offset their costs by selling the byproducts, things like fluorine or phosphates for fertilizers. Okay, so now let's flip over to the stark contrast. The West has taken a completely different path, one that really prizes purity above everything else. But as we're about to see, this chase for perfection, it comes with a really high and often kind of hidden cost. And this line right here gets to the absolute heart of the problem for the West. Because every mine is unique, with its own specific pure ore. every single processing plant built to handle it has to be designed from scratch. Just like the source says, each new project becomes a bespoke, one-of-a-kind prototype. And this creates what we can call the prototype problem. It means you're spending years and tons of money on pilot testing just to prove one specific process works for one specific mine. It means every single mine needs its own unique chemical recipe or flow sheet. This just massively jacks up the technical and financial risk for any new project, and it makes it almost impossible for one plant to ever process ore from a different source. And you can't see this difference in philosophy any clearer than in how the two sides look at radioactive byproducts, like thorium. China is increasingly looking at it as a potential asset, fuel for future advanced nuclear reactors. But in the West, it's almost always treated as a costly liability, a hazardous waste that you have to pay a fortune to get rid of. The real-world impact of this is just staggering. This regulatory friction, as they call it, effectively disqualifies huge amounts of potential rare earth feedstock from ever even entering the Western supply chain, just because it has a little thorium in it. The pool of available raw materials just shrinks dramatically. So, this all brings us to the big aha moment, what we're calling the efficiency gap. What we're really looking at here are two totally different industrial models. One is built on these massive, standardized, adaptable wheels, and the other is constantly being forced to reinvent the wheel every single time. And the consequence is pretty obvious when you look at it this way. China's standardized, massive wheels approach gives them incredible processing scale and flexibility. Meanwhile, the Western model, this collection of individual, one-off prototypes, is stuck operating at a much lower capacity with almost zero flexibility to adapt. Let's just break this down side by side real quick. When it comes to philosophy, it's embracing complexity versus trying to avoid risk at all costs. For the process, it's standardized and robust versus bespoke and unique. For feedstock, it's accepting all the messy stuff versus only seeking out the pure ores. And for byproducts, it's recovering them as assets versus just managing them as liabilities. So why does all this technical detail actually matter? Well, because this efficiency gap, it isn't just some academic thing to debate. It has profound, direct consequences for the entire global supply chain and for the future of every technology that depends on these critical resources. So as we wrap this up, what are the big things to remember? First, the real dominance in rare earths comes from chemical processing know-how, not just from digging rocks out of the ground. Second, your whole industrial philosophy, whether you run toward complexity or run away from risk, that's what determines your efficiency. Third, how you regulate byproducts like radioactive elements creates massive advantages or massive bottlenecks. And finally, at the end of the day, this whole thing is a story of standardized, massive scale versus a collection of individual, bespoke prototypes.
And that really brings us to the central question, doesn't it? On one hand, you've got the dominant player who's just making their existing systems smarter and smarter with software. And on the other, you have the challengers, and they're betting the farm on brand new, revolutionary hardware. So what wins? Do you perfect the system you already have, or do you invent something completely new?
Okay, so first up, let's look at the reigning champ, China. Now, they've dominated the rare earths market for a long, long time, but they are not resting on their laurels. They're deploying what you could call a secret weapon, a super sophisticated AI system designed to perfect a process they've already mastered.
And the foundation of all that dominance is a technology called the mixer settler. I want you to picture this. It's not some sleek, modern machine. It's a well-established, kind of brute force industrial process. Think vast, sprawling plants with a huge physical footprint. And here's the key part. China has decades and decades of data from running these things. So to really get a sense of the scale here, this solvent extraction process, it's not just one step. It's a cascade of hundreds of these mixer settler stages all linked together. And in every single stage, you're trying to balance all these variables: pH, flow rate, temperature. It's like trying to spin hundreds of plates at once. Doing that by hand, almost impossible. And that right there is where the AI comes in. It's the perfect tool to dynamically manage the entire system in real time.
And look, we're not talking about some basic spreadsheet software here. This is seriously advanced stuff. We're talking about algorithms that can model the whole separation process as it's happening, accounting for all the messy, real-world conditions that a simple model would miss. They're even creating digital twins, basically a perfect virtual copy of the entire plant, so they can test out changes in the simulation before they risk doing it for real. The bottom line is, the software running these facilities is probably years ahead of anything being used in the West.
So, after all that, the crazy complexity, the digital twins, the real-time modeling, what do they get out of it? a 1% gain in efficiency. And I know what you're thinking. 1%? That's it? All that for 1%? But just hold on a second.
Because when you're operating at the massive industrial scale that China is, that tiny 1%, it translates into millions upon millions of dollars. We're talking hundreds of extra tons of critical strategic material. That's the hidden efficiency gap we're talking about. It's a small number, but it has a huge strategic punch.
All right, so how on earth is the West supposed to compete with that? Well, faced with this super optimized giant, they're not trying to just build a slightly better mixer settler. No way. They're trying to leapfrog the whole system with a really high risk, but potentially high reward, hardware gamble.
And really, the difference in philosophy couldn't be more clear. The Western approach isn't about writing better software for the old machines. It's about building entirely new machines that work on completely different physical principles. They're trying to change the game itself.
I mean, just look at the physical difference. It's night and day. China's mixer settlers take up a massive amount of space. This new Western hardware, it's way, way smaller. It also means less of that expensive material is just sitting around, locked up in the system at any one time. Fundamentally, it's a move away from a slow, gravity-based process to something much, much faster.
So who are the companies actually making this big bet? Well, you've got players like Ucore Rare Metals. Their tech, RapidSX, basically swaps out those giant vats for these sleek, compact columns. Then there's Rainbow Rare Earths. They're using a process called continuous ion exchange to literally pull valuable elements out of what used to be considered industrial waste. These are the guys with the revolutionary ideas.
And just to give you an idea of the potential here, let's talk about something called residence time. It's basically how long the material has to sit inside the system to get processed. With the old mixer settlers, we're talking about 32 hours. With Rainbow's new CIX tech, just 8 hours. I mean, that is a massive, massive leap in speed and efficiency.
And this is where we get to the heart of the matter, which you might call the efficiency paradox. On one hand, you have a strategy that is proven, it's reliable, it works. On the other, you have something with absolutely incredible potential, but it also comes with this giant question mark hanging over it.
When you put these two strategies side by side, they're a perfect study in contrasts. China's ace in the hole is that mountain of real-world operational data. The West's advantage? Superior performance, at least on paper. But, and this is the big but, the West's greatest risk is something called the validation gap.
So, what exactly is this validation gap? Well, think of it as the dangerous chasm between a successful little pilot project and a massive industrial plant that has to run 24/7. It's that moment of truth where you find out if your revolutionary hardware can actually scale up without hitting some unexpected, catastrophic problem that you just couldn't see at a small scale. It is, quite literally, the gap between a great idea and a proven reality.
So this really brings us to the final verdict, or at least where things stand right now. The race isn't about which technology is better in some abstract theoretical sense. It's all about a fundamental strategic choice. Do you bet on what you know works, or do you bet on what you hope will work even better?
And there's a quote from our source material that just sums it all up perfectly. It says, "The whole thing is defined by China's operational certainty versus the West's technological promise." And that's it, right there. One is built on certainty, the other is built on promise. One is reliable, and the other is revolutionary, but risky. We hear a ton about separation, the process of refining raw ore, as the main bottleneck. But the true choke point, the real weak link, is one step further down the line: metalization. See, separation gets you a pile of specialized powder. That's great. But metalization, that's the magic step that turns that powder into the high-purity metals you absolutely need for advanced magnets. This is the Achilles heel of the entire non-Chinese supply chain.
So what exactly is this critical step? Let's take a closer look at the process of forging usable metal from what is essentially a specialized kind of dust. Okay, so here's the technical definition. Metalization takes those rare earth oxides, that powder we just talked about, and transforms them. The key method is something called high-temperature molten salt electrolysis. Just think of it as a super advanced, incredibly hot, and extremely precise form of electrosmelting.
In theory, the process is pretty straightforward. You start with the oxide powder, you apply this electrolysis process, and you end up with a usable rare earth metal or alloy. And that final product is what's needed to manufacture those powerful permanent magnets that go into, well, everything, from F-35 fighter jets to wind turbines and electric vehicles.
And when we say high temperature, we really mean it. The furnaces for this, they're called electrolytic pots or cells, have to be kept at a stable 1,000 degrees Celsius. This makes it an incredibly energy-intensive operation. You absolutely need a massive and stable supply of cheap power just to make it economically viable. But listen, this isn't just about building a big furnace and flipping a switch. Electrolysis is famously described as a finicky process. It's as much an art as it is a science. You need deep institutional knowledge and operators with years of experience who can manage these cells, prevent disruptions, and make sure the final metal has the exact right purity. This is not knowledge you can just pull from a textbook.
So all this technical expertise brings us to the geopolitical reality of metallization, and to what you could call China's furnace empire. Because there is one country that has absolutely mastered this art and science on an industrial scale.
The numbers really tell the whole story here. Get this. China produces about 94% of the world's rare earth magnets. And since you literally cannot make the magnets without the metal, this one statistic shows a near total lock on the global metallization step. This is the very heart of their dominance.
So how do they do it? Well, it's not just one thing, it's a whole strategy. They have these massive facilities with sprawling halls of electrolytic cells. They power them with subsidized, stable electricity, which is a huge advantage. They keep their furnace utilization rates super high to maintain thermal efficiency. And, maybe the most important piece of the puzzle, they control the rules of the game by setting the global standards.
And this is where it gets really clever, where technical standards become a strategic weapon. China sets its own national standard called GBT. It's perfectly optimized for their domestic magnet industry, and it's even tailored to the specific impurities you find in Chinese ore. This means Western producers who are using different ore can really struggle to meet that spec. It effectively creates a non-tariff barrier, forcing them to either play by China's rules or produce to a much stricter, more expensive Western standard just to compete.
Okay, so given China's overwhelming dominance, who are the global challengers trying to compete? As you might guess, the field is incredibly small.
Outside of China's massive state-supported scale, the landscape is pretty sparse. Over in Estonia, you have a company called Neo Performance Materials. They operate the only commercial scale plant in Europe. Their advantage is this deep institutional knowledge from its Soviet-era legacy, but it's still a small volume strategic player. Then you have Vietnam, which is kind of emerging as a potential backup. They have huge reserves and growing foreign investment, but their projects are still in the very early pilot stages.
And just to put Vietnam's progress in perspective, a recent investment from a South Korean firm to build out their metallization capacity was around $19.3 million. I mean, it's a start for sure, but it just highlights this immense gap in scale and the long, tough road ahead to replicate the decades of knowledge that's been built up in China. So is this whole thing a bridge too far? When you put all these pieces together, it really starts to reveal what might be a massive strategic blind spot for the West.
And here it is. This is the core takeaway. The West is investing heavily in mines and in separation plants. You know, the ones that produce rare earth oxides. Companies like MP Materials, Linus, and Arafura, they're all focused on this upstream part of the chain. But they have almost completely neglected the crucial metallization step.
This leads to what is basically a fatal flaw in the current strategy. Without domestic metallization, Western companies produce their oxide powder only to have to ship it right back to Asia and often to China for conversion into metal. This just completely negates the entire strategic goal of supply chain independence. It's a loop that leads right back to the beginning.
So let's frame this whole thing with a kind of weird question. Why is mining a mountain of solid rock so much harder than just watering it? Yeah, I know that sounds a little crazy, but trust me, the answer to that one question explains the entire global struggle over these critical materials. Stick with me here and you'll see exactly what I mean. Okay, so here's how we're gonna break it all down. First, we'll look at the heavy rare earth problem itself. Then we'll dive into China's unique geological situation. After that, we'll see how the West does things the hard way. We'll compare the costs, and finally, we'll explore how the rest of the world is trying to compete on a totally different playing field. All right, first up, the heavy rare earth problem. Now, the most important thing to get your head around right away is that China's dominance, it isn't just about their industrial power or cheaper labor. Nope, it's geological. The actual rock and dirt they're standing on is fundamentally different from almost anywhere else. So when we say heavy rare earths, or HREs, what are we really talking about? Well, it mostly boils down to these two absolute superstars, dysprosium and terbium. You can think of these as the secret sauce, the magic ingredients for the super powerful magnets that make our modern world go round. We're talking electric vehicles, massive wind turbines, you name it. Without them, our green tech future pretty much grinds to a halt. And this slide, this right here is the absolute heart of the matter. The entire economic gap, the whole reason for this story, comes down to one simple fundamental difference. China gets to extract ions from clay, while the West has to extract atoms from solid crystal rock. Now, what does that mean? Well, think of the ions like little particles that are just kind of clinging to the surface of the clay. They're easy to wash off. The atoms, on the other hand, are physically locked inside a crystal structure. You have to literally smash the rock to bits to get them out. It's a completely different ballgame.
So, that huge difference brings us to what's really China's geological anomaly. We're calling it the easy and dirty method, and you'll see why. It's incredibly simple, unbelievably cheap to get started, but oh boy, does it come with a massive hidden environmental cost. So, how does this actually work? Well, down in southern China, they have these really unique clays. And in these clays, the rare earth elements aren't chemically bonded into a hard mineral. Instead, they're just sort of stuck to the surface of the clay particles. They're in that ionic state, which basically means they're just loosely attached, almost like static cling. They're just waiting for something to come along and rinse them right off. And because of that unique geology, the process for getting them out is, well, it's almost ridiculously simple. Seriously. Step 1, you drill some holes into a hillside. Step 2, you pour in a solution of ammonium sulfate, which, by the way, is basically just a type of fertilizer. And step 3, you just collect the liquid that drains out the bottom, which is now full of those rare earth ions. That's it. That's the whole process. So you can immediately see the economic advantage, right? It's really about everything they don't have to do. They don't need giant energy-guzzling rock crushers. They don't need massive grinding mills. There are no high-temperature kilns roasting ore for hours, and no giant vats of super aggressive assets. They get to skip all the most expensive, most complicated parts of traditional hard rock mining. It's a massive shortcut.
But, and this is a huge but, there's a massive catch. A quote from one of the sources we looked at just says it all. However, the environmental efficiency is catastrophic. So while it's cheap, the damage it leaves behind is, well, it's off the charts.
And this easy method has led to some absolutely devastating environmental damage, especially in the past. We are talking about injecting ammonia, a contaminant, directly into the groundwater. We're talking about causing severe soil erosion, leading to landslides, and poisoning the entire area with heavy metals. Now, to be fair, China is cracking down on this stuff now, but the legacy of that damage and the temptation for illegal miners to keep doing it the cheap and dirty way, that's still very real.
Okay, so that's one side of the coin. Now let's flip it over and look at the complete opposite, the Western hard rock way. You can think of this as the hard and clean approach. It's technologically complex, it's way more expensive, but it has the potential to be a whole lot cleaner. See, pretty much everywhere else in the world, these heavy rare earths are found locked deep inside hard rock minerals, mainly one called xenotime. A perfect example is a project called Browns Range over in Australia. In a place like that, the dysprosium and terbium aren't just clinging to the surface. No, they are an integral part of the actual crystal structure of the rock itself. You can't just wash them off. So how do you get them out? Well, it's a completely different beast. Look at this flow sheet. First, you have to crush the rock. Then you have to grind it into a fine powder. Then you use powerful magnets and various chemicals to separate out the minerals you want. And then, and this is the really energy-intensive part, you have to bake it in a kiln at over 300 degrees Celsius with concentrated acid just to crack those crystals open and release the atoms. It's a massive industrial process. So to put it simply, the Western method is all about brute force. It's using just immense amounts of mechanical energy, chemical energy, and thermal energy to literally rip atoms out of a crystal lattice. It is the very definition of heavy industry. And this, naturally, brings us to a direct comparison, a tale of two costs. And the key thing to remember here is that the price difference isn't really about labor or regulations. It's dictated by the basic laws of physics and chemistry. You just can't get around it. This chart really just lays it all out in black and white. Look at the energy required, the chemicals, the reagents required. For the Western method, it's not just a little bit higher, it's orders of magnitude higher. That's 10 times, 100 times more. That creates a structural, fundamental difference in the base cost of production, that is just incredibly hard to overcome. And this brings us right back to that question I asked at the very beginning. What's the core difference? It's this. On one side, you're basically watering a hill with fertilizer. On the other, you are pulverizing solid rock in a furnace. The fundamental physics of those two actions means one is always going to be cheaper than the other. Period.
So, you might be thinking, if the basic costs are so wildly different, is there any hope for the West? And that brings us to our final section, competing on a different field. See, it's not about trying to beat China at their own low-cost game. That's probably impossible. It's about changing the rules of the game entirely.
Which leads to the million-dollar question, right? If your fundamental production cost is always going to be higher simply because of the rock you're digging up, are you just doomed to fail? Well, not necessarily. Instead of trying to compete on cost alone, Western projects are getting clever. They're using a few key strategies. First, there's the ESG angle, marketing ethically and environmentally sourced materials that some customers will pay a premium for. Second, logistics, building super efficient single-site facilities to cut down on transportation. And third, and this is probably the most important one, is byproducts. They're figuring out how to use everything else in the rock to help pay the bills. Yeah, this polymetallic or multi-metal approach is the real game changer here. A project might find that it can also extract valuable phosphoric acid, for example, from the same ore. The money they make selling that secondary product helps subsidize the really high cost of producing the rare earths. For these hard rock mines, this isn't just a nice little bonus. It is an absolutely essential survival strategy to even try and close that economic gap with China's unique geology. All right, let's jump right in. When we talk about the global competition for rare earth elements, you might picture a simple, straightforward race. But the reality? It's way more complex. It's less of a race and more of a unique, strategic chase. And to really get it, we need to look at three very different gaps between China and the West. And you know, the source material for this explainer just nails it with this one powerful phrase, asymptotic pursuit. It might sound like a math term, but trust me, it perfectly captures the dynamic we're about to unpack. So what does that actually mean? Well, picture this. You're in a chase and you are constantly closing the distance to your target. You're getting closer and closer, infinitely closer, but you never actually reach it. And that is the perfect metaphor for the West's decades-long struggle to catch up to China's total dominance in the rare earths industry. It's a constant chase, always getting nearer, but never quite achieving parity. But here's the thing, it's not all bad news. Our story actually begins on a note of real optimism, because in one specific area, the gap is actually closing. This is our first gap. We're talking about light rare earths, or LREs. Now, these are elements like neodymium and praseodymium. You'll often just hear them called NdPr. And they are the absolute magic ingredients for the high-performance permanent magnets inside things like electric vehicle motors and giant wind turbines. And what's so interesting here is that you can see real, tangible progress. Western companies like MP Materials in the US and Lynas in Australia, well, they've made huge strides. They've proven they can be stable and profitable. And their recovery rates? They are getting genuinely competitive with the Chinese standard. It suggests the West absolutely can compete on cost for these specific elements. But, and this is a big but, true parity is still just out of reach. See, Western companies are up against higher costs for environmental compliance. They just don't have those deeply integrated chemical supply chains you see in China, and they're still fine-tuning how to optimize their chemical use. So yeah, the gap is closing, but it is not closed yet. Okay, let's move on to our second gap, because this is where the strategies just completely split apart. This is no longer about catching up, it's about a high-stakes technological gamble on two totally different paths forward. So on one side, you've got Team China. They're basically saying, hey, what we have already works, and it works at a massive scale. Let's just use AI and digital twins to make it even more efficient. It's a low-risk play for small, steady gains. Then you have Team West. They're trying to change the whole game. They're betting the farm on brand new, unproven tech that promises to be cheaper and cleaner. It's a much higher risk. And that right there is the central question. If these new Western technologies actually work as advertised, the West could literally leapfrog China in efficiency. But if they stumble, if the tech doesn't scale up from the lab, well, the West could find itself years further behind. It is a massive, massive gamble. And now we come to the third, and honestly, the most sobering part of this story. This isn't just a gap anymore. The source material calls it a chasm, and it's where the West's dependency on China becomes absolute. Yeah, just let that word sink in. It really captures the scale of the problem. We're not talking about a gap that can be closed anymore. We're talking about a fundamental, structural void in the entire Western supply chain. So this chasm, it exists in what are called heavy rare earths, or HREs. We're talking about elements like dysprosium and terbium. They're used in tiny, tiny amounts in high-performance magnets, but they're absolutely essential. They're what lets those magnets withstand scorching hot temperatures, something you have to have for advanced defense systems and the most efficient EVs. So why is this a chasm and not just a gap? Well, it boils down to a few key reasons. First, the West has almost zero capacity to do the final, crucial step of turning rare earth oxides into actual metal. Second, there's a geological problem. Most Western deposits are in hard rock, which is way more complex to process for these heavies than the special ionic clays found in China. And finally, China just completely dominates the highest value steps, making the metals and the specialized alloys for magnets. So, when you put these three gaps together, the closing gap, the tech gamble, and the chasm, a much bigger picture starts to emerge. The real problem isn't just about a single technology or one specific mine. It's about the entire industrial ecosystem. 40, that's the number. 40 years. That is the head start China has in building its fully integrated rare earth ecosystem. Think about that for a second. A 4-decade head start where every single part of the supply chain was designed to connect to the next. That is an almost unbelievable strategic advantage. The source material uses another incredible metaphor to get this across. Western projects, even the really successful ones, are like islands of efficiency in a disconnected sea. They might be great at what they do, but they're all alone out there. And the contrast just couldn't be more stark. Chinese state-owned enterprises, they aren't islands. They are a continent, a vast interconnected landmass where everything is linked. And this is what that continent looks like. Mining flows seamlessly into separation, which flows right into metallization, which then feeds directly into magnet manufacturing, often all happening within the same giant company. It's a closed-loop, self-reinforcing system that is incredibly hard to compete against, one piece at a time.
All right, let's get right into it. The West is in this high-stakes race, right? They're trying to build a rare earths supply chain that's completely independent of China. But here's the thing. When you actually look at the books of the big companies leading the charge, it's a baffling paradox. I mean, they're spending billions, they're losing money hand over fist, and they're racking up huge amounts of debt. So the big question is, how on earth are they still in business?
Yeah, that's the central mystery we're going to crack in this explainer. Because, on paper, a lot of these companies, they should be teetering on the edge of collapse. And yet, they're still building, they're still expanding. Something just doesn't add up.
Okay, so first, let's just set the stage a little. You've got to understand, this isn't just about business, not by a long shot. This is a massive geopolitical issue. Getting away from a single supplier isn't just a good idea, it's become a matter of national security.
And right there, that's the core conflict. On one hand, you have this clear, simple goal, but on the other, you have the brutal reality of economics and engineering. And as you're about to see, the raw numbers, the math of trying to compete with China's deeply entrenched state-backed industry, well, it's just absolutely unforgiving.
So, okay, let's dig into the numbers. This is where it gets really interesting. Because to figure out how these guys are surviving, first you have to appreciate the sheer, crushing scale of the financial pressure they're under. The costs, they are just staggering. Let's take Iluka Resources in Australia, for example. Their plan for a brand new refinery. It started with a budget of $1.2 billion. Not cheap, right? Well, that has now exploded to $1.8 billion. I mean, this isn't some minor miscalculation. That's a massive capital overrun that would absolutely cripple most normal projects. Or hey, let's look at the American champion MP Materials. While they were busy building out their own refining capacity, their debt just surged. We're talking over 33% in just 1 year. Think about that. They're funding this huge strategic shift by piling on a mountain of debt, and that completely changes the game when it comes to their financial risk.
Now this is where we really see why the costs are so insane. Look at this. When MP Materials was just a miner, just digging up concentrate and shipping it out, their costs were, a manageable 37% of their revenue. Totally fine. But the moment they started refining it themselves, bam, that cost skyrockets to 94% of revenue. All of their profit margins, they just vanished. Poof, gone.
And this quote right here, it just nails it. It basically says that all the great money you can make from just digging rocks out of the ground, it completely evaporates. It falls apart the second you have to deal with the massive operational expenses, the OPEX, of doing all that complex chemical separation, especially under strict Western regulations. And look, this financial crisis, it's not just hitting one company. It's hitting all the key players, just in slightly different ways. So let's do a quick profile of the 4 main companies that are trying to anchor this whole Western supply chain.
Okay, first up, MP Materials. You can think of their problem as the pivot penalty. See, to get their own new refinery up and running, they had to stop selling the raw stuff to China. But that was their main source of cash. They basically had to turn off the money tap. And the result? A whopping negative cash flow of $114 million in just the first half of 2025.
All right, next we have Lynas. These guys are the seasoned veterans out of Australia, really the only major producer outside of China for the last decade. So you'd think they'd have this down, right? But even with all that experience, they are getting absolutely hammered by cost overruns. Their new facility in Calgary, the budget jumped from $500 million all the way up to $800 million.
Then you've got Iluka, the company making that big, ambitious jump from mineral sands into rare earths. And honestly, they might be in the toughest spot of all. Think about this. They've already burned through nearly $200 million in just 6 months on a project that's now going to cost $1.8 billion. And their revenue from rare earths so far? A big, fat zero. Nothing.
And finally, let's talk about Neo Performance Materials. Now they're a little different. They don't dig anything out of the ground. They just do the processing. And that's actually kept them pretty financially stable. But, and it's a big but, their entire model has a huge vulnerability. They've always depended on Russian and Chinese material to feed their plants. So if that supply ever gets cut off, their whole business is at risk. So, okay, let's recap. We've got 4 essential companies, and every single one of them is facing what looks like a total deal breaker, either financially or strategically. So this brings us right back to that big question from the start. How are they still alive? Well, here's the answer. It's because this isn't about normal market economics. Not at all. It's about a massive hidden safety. The key concept here, the thing that unlocks this entire mystery, is something called a sovereign put option. The easiest way to think about it is like a government insurance policy. It's this unspoken promise from the government to a company that's just too important to fail. It's them saying, hey, go ahead and build that crazy expensive thing. If the market goes south and you're about to go bankrupt, don't worry, we got you. We won't let you fail. And that just completely rewrites the rules of the game for risk and investment. And boom, here it is. This is the big aha moment. Just look at the 2 different realities for a company like MP Materials. In one world, the normal open market world, the Chinese price for their product is sitting at, say, 50 or 60 bucks a kilo. In that world, MP's margins are a disaster. They're deep in the red. Bankruptcy isn't just a risk, it's pretty much a certainty. But in the other reality, the one backed by the government, the Department of Defense steps in and guarantees them a price floor of $110. Suddenly their margins are protected, their survival is, for all intents and purposes, guaranteed. And the really crucial thing to understand is that this isn't just a one-off for one company. When you connect the dots, you see a clear pattern. MP Materials, they're getting cash injections and that price floor from the DoD. Iluka's project, which honestly makes no commercial sense on its own, it's being kept alive by a massive $1.25 billion loan from the Australian government, a loan they don't even have to pay back if the project fails. Even Lynas is able to raise money because investors know it's strategically important. And Neo, they're linking up with government-adjacent companies to make sure they get their materials. It's happening everywhere.
So when you have this level of government intervention, you're not just saving a few companies. You are fundamentally remaking the entire market. You're creating a whole new structure with a totally new set of rules.
What you end up with is basically a 2-tier market, a system of haves and have-nots. In that top tier, you've got the chosen ones, the government-backed champions, like MP and Iluka. They're wrapped in a protective bubble, shielded from market prices. They can afford to bleed cash to build these strategic assets. But then you have the bottom tier. These are the smaller junior miners. They're out in the cold, totally exposed to whatever the market price is. For them, the threat of bankruptcy is real and it's constant. There's no safety net to catch them if they fall.
In the high-stakes world of rare earth minerals, there is a serious battle for survival raging right now. We're going to dig into why some Western mining companies are thriving with government help, while others, well, they're facing a brutal cash crunch that could threaten the entire tech and defense supply chain for the West.
This quote, it just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It points to this deep, dangerous divide in an industry that is absolutely critical, a divide that has massive geopolitical consequences. So let's break down what this valley of death really means. So what's actually happening on the ground? You see, the market for these minerals, and we're talking about stuff that's essential for everything from electric vehicles to fighter jets, it's splitting right down the middle. On one side, you have a few companies that have solid government backing, but on the other, you have a whole bunch of smaller, junior miners who are just teetering on the edge of collapse. They've fallen into what everyone's now calling the Valley of Death.
Now, the Valley of Death isn't just about being a little low on cash. Oh no, it is a full-blown financial trap. It's a situation where every possible solution, like trying to raise new money, comes at a catastrophic cost to the company's founders and original investors. It's a real dead end, where the road to survival can be just as destructive as failing completely.
To really see this in action, let's look at a real-world example. Hastings Technology Metals gives us a perfect and pretty painful picture of a company struggling deep inside this valley. $822 million. Let that sink in for a second. That's their net loss in a single year. This isn't just a bad quarter. This is a number that signals a potential death spiral. It raises really serious questions about whether the company can even survive. This is the crisis, right here, captured in one staggering number.
And when you look at the books, the problem just stares you right in the face. They've got almost $129 million in debt, compared to just under $11 million in the bank. I mean, when your cash is that dwarfed by what you owe, you're forced to take some really desperate measures just to stay afloat.
And that desperate measure is called asset stripping. To get some cash in the door quick, Hastings had to sell off its gold assets. This is a textbook move for a company in deep, deep trouble. You're basically sacrificing valuable, long-term potential just to keep the lights on for another few months. Okay, so what happens if a company actually manages to avoid a total collapse? What does survival even look like? Well, even for the ones who find a lifeline, the cost can be incredibly high. We're going to see this play out with our next two examples, Arafura and VHM. They found two very different but equally painful paths forward. So first up, we have Arafura Rare Earths. Now they did it. They managed to secure the funding they needed for their huge project over in Australia. But this rescue came with a very, very steep price for their existing investors. Here's the deal. To get that $475 million in cash, they had to issue a ton of new shares. And what happens when you do that? The original shareholders, the folks who believed in the company from the start, saw their ownership stake get watered down by a massive 40%. So yeah, the company survived, but a huge chunk of its value was basically handed over from its early believers to new investors with deep pockets. All right, next up is VHM Limited. Their story is a little less about financial dilution and a lot more about walking this insane geopolitical tightrope. They had to make a critical choice: stick with a Chinese partner or get access to Western funding.
So on the surface, the public story from VHM was that they were ending their deal with China's Shanghai Resources to, maximize optionality. Sounds pretty standard, right? But the real story was much more dramatic. That deal had become what's known as a poison pill. As long as it was in place, there was absolutely no way they could get critical funding from American and Australian government agencies. The money was off the table. They were literally forced to pick a side in this great power competition.
So while all of this drama is unfolding and Western companies are making these painful choices, Chinese state-backed firms are playing a completely different game, a much faster game. And the acquisition of Peak Rare Earths, it's a perfect example of just how different their playbook is.
I mean, the contrast here is just night and day. The Western path to getting a project funded is slow, it's bureaucratic, it's bogged down in reviews and negotiations. But the Chinese path? In late 2025, while the West was still deliberating, Shanghai Resources just came in and boom, a swift all-cash takeover. Done deal.
And get this, they did it for what looks like a bargain. For just 195 million Australian dollars in cash, Shanghai picked up a major, high-grade rare earth asset in Tanzania. And just like that, with one single transaction, a key strategic resource was effectively taken out of the potential Western supply chain and secured for China.
So you might be asking, why does the fate of these individual companies really matter in the grand scheme of things? Well, it's because this isn't just about corporate profits and losses. What we're watching is a global race for the critical minerals that will power our green future and our national defense. Every single one of these corporate wins and losses shifts the global balance of power.
So let's just quickly recap the big takeaways here.
First, Western junior miners are stuck in this valley of death because of high debt and tough financing. Second, even when they do get Western funding, it often comes at the crippling cost of dilution. Third, geopolitics is forcing companies to ditch Chinese partners to get that Western support. And all the while, Chinese state-backed firms are moving decisively, using cash to snap up strategic assets quickly and cheaply. The end result? A major
And look, the analysis that this is all based on, it makes a really stark argument. It says that the entire economic game plan of the Western rare earth industry is, and I'm quoting here, structurally flawed. This isn't some temporary speed bump or a minor issue. We're talking about a fundamental problem with the entire approach. So let's break down exactly why. All right, so the first huge roadblock, it's what people in the industry call the China price. And this isn't just about, lower wages or something simple like that. It's an entire economic ecosystem that creates this deep structural chasm between what it costs to produce in China versus literally anywhere else. Okay, just look at this chart. It lays out the sheer scale of that chasm. Let's take a key rare earth oxide. The production cost in China, that's the bar on the left, is somewhere around 35 to 50 bucks a kilogram. Now look over to the right. For a new Western project to even make financial sense, the market price has to be over $75. They're not just in different leagues, they're playing completely different games. So how is a gap like that even possible? Well, it really boils down to three main things. First up, Western projects are just way more expensive to build. We're talking nearly double the cost per kilogram of capacity compared to what it cost in China historically. Second, China's day-to-day operating costs are lower thanks to infrastructure that's already there and state-subsidized waste management. And third, you've got direct state subsidies, like a 13% tax rebate on exports, which just pushes Chinese costs down to a floor that Western companies simply cannot compete with. So as if the economics weren't tough enough, the problem gets even worse when you stop talking about mining the raw materials and start talking about actually processing them. This is the big technology bottleneck, and it's especially bad for the most valuable materials, the heavy rare earths. The key piece of tech here is something called solvent extraction. The easiest way to think about it is like an incredibly complicated chemical filtering process. Because all these rare earth elements have really similar properties, you need literally hundreds of precise, complex stages to pull one element away from another. It's difficult, it's messy, and it takes an immense amount of expertise. And this right here is probably the most crucial number in this entire explainer. When it comes to separating those critical heavy rare earths, China controls 99.9% of the world's capacity. No, that's not a typo. It's a near total absolute monopoly on the single most critical step in the whole supply chain. So what's the West doing about it? Well, as this table shows, their efforts are, let's just say, they're in their infancy. You've got Lynas, which runs the only commercial facility outside of China, but its capacity is just a tiny fraction of what the world needs. Other projects are either years away from even starting, or they're working with new tech that hasn't been proven at the massive scale you need to compete. The takeaway here? The West is just miles and miles behind. Okay, so when you put a massive economic disadvantage together with a near-total monopoly on technology, what do you get? Well, you get an unavoidable result, a massive supply deficit. The world is heading toward a future where there simply won't be enough of these critical materials produced outside of China to meet demand. Let's make this real for a second. Take dysprosium. It's absolutely essential for the high-performance magnets you find in electric vehicles and wind turbines. By 2035, the world is projected to be short by nearly 3,000 tons of the stuff. That is a huge gap that's going to hit our green energy and technology goals hard. And this chart, wow, it just lays out the brutal reality. By 2035, even if all the planned new Western mines come online, they'll only be able to supply about 29% of the heavy rare earth demand outside of China. That's that little slice of the pie. That leaves a staggering 71% deficit. That's a massive chunk left over. It's the ultimate proof that just digging stuff out of the ground is pretty much useless if you have nowhere to process it. And listen, this isn't some problem for, the distant future. Right now, today, the processing gap is described as effectively absolute. Think about it. 2026? Nope. No significant non-Chinese capacities coming online. 2027? Same story. The gap is still absolute. The very earliest anyone even hopes to see a meaningful change isn't until 2028. We are in the bottleneck today. So what's the real-world consequence of all this? The cost gap, the tech gap, the supply gap? Well, the analysis points to one serious implication: a global market that's literally splitting in two. And this split, it's not a prediction. It is happening right now. Just look at the price for dysprosium. If you're buying it outside of China, say in Rotterdam, it recently hit $900 a kilogram. The price inside China, just $255. That means a Western manufacturer is paying nearly 4 times more for the exact same material. That is what a split global market actually looks like.
And it all really boils down to this one massive question. Who is going to control the building blocks of our future? So what's fueling this whole thing? Well, it's this really interesting economic idea called the valuation gap. Just picture this. You've got a small mining company, and they're sitting on a literal mountain of treasure, but for whatever reason, their stock price is just in the basement. That huge disconnect, that gap between the value in the ground and the price on the market, it makes them incredibly vulnerable. It turns them into prey.
And this is exactly what we're calling the rare earth hunt. You've got it right there on the screen. In this market, there are predators and there is prey. That valuation gap has created the absolute perfect hunting ground for takeovers, where players with really deep pockets can just swoop in and scoop up these resource-rich companies for pennies on the dollar.
So just how big is this gap we're talking about? Let's put some numbers on it. A lot of these smaller so-called junior miners are trading at just 20 to 30% of what their assets are actually worth. Let me put that another way. It's like buying $1 million house for 200 grand. It is a fire sale, and you can bet the predators are circling. So who exactly are these hunters? All right, let's meet the predators. What we're seeing are two very, very different groups stalking these assets, and they each have a completely different playbook for how they're going to win this game.
And these two sides could not be more different. On one hand, you have Chinese state-backed companies. Their motive is super straightforward: secure raw materials to feed their gigantic refining industry back home. Their method: they find struggling Western companies and buy them at a discount, offering that quick cash that other markets just won't provide. The end goal, of course, is total domination of the supply chain. Then on the other side, you've got what's called Western strategic capital. Their motive is basically pure defense, stop China from cornering the market, and their method is to try and consolidate all those undervalued little miners into one big, powerful Western champion that can actually compete.
And look, the stakes here couldn't be higher. This strategy of buying up distressed assets poses, and this is a direct quote from our source material, a significant threat to Western resource security. It's a really smart strategic move, right? Why build your own supply chain when you can just buy the source of your competitors? Now, you might be thinking the Western predators are the huge mining companies, like BHP or Rio Tinto. But, surprise, they're mostly sitting this one out. They're focused on bigger stuff, like iron ore. The real players here are much more specialized. Think defense-related funds or these powerful strategic family offices. They're the ones who see the national security angle, and they're stepping in, often with the goal of creating one single government-backed champion to push back against China.
But, okay, just when this whole predator-prey dynamic seems completely locked in, a new player walks onto the field. And we're calling this the Brazilian wild card. A discovery down in Brazil is threatening to completely flip the script on the entire rare earth market.
Now, to really get why this is such a huge deal, you got to look at how this stuff is made. Traditionally, you get rare earths from hard rock. It's a brutal, dirty, super energy-hungry process of cracking and roasting rock at insane temperatures. But these new deposits in Brazil, they're totally different. They're called ionic absorption clays, and that just means the rare earths can be kind of gently washed out using a simple chemical solution, basically at room temperature. This is a complete geological and technological game changer.
To really feel the impact, let's talk about the price tag. Building one of those traditional hard rock mining and processing plants, well, it's a massive undertaking. The typical cost to get one of those up and running? Over $1 billion.
Now get this. The projected capital cost for one of these massive new ionic clay projects in Brazil is just $43 million. No, that is not a typo. It is orders of magnitude cheaper. It completely rewrites the economics of this entire industry.
And it's not just the startup cost either. The ongoing day-to-day operating costs for these Brazilian projects are expected to be right there with even the lowest cost producers in China, the country that has absolutely dominated this market for decades. This is a direct challenge to their throne. But hold on, before we declare Brazil the new king, there is a catch. The market has a name for it, the Brazil discount. And it's this idea that all of this incredible, game-changing potential comes with its own very significant set of risks and challenges. So what are these hurdles? Well, for starters, a lot of these mining regions just don't have the basic infrastructure. And Brazil doesn't have the high-tech facilities to fully process the minerals, which means they have to ship them overseas to get the final product. Then you've got crucial environmental permits that are still up in the air, and maybe the biggest question mark of all, they still have to prove that this simple-sounding process actually works at a massive commercial scale.
So, where does all of this leave us? It leaves us smack in the middle of a global race for resources. The hunt is absolutely on, all the players are making their moves, but the final outcome is anything but certain. So let's just break it down one last time. The state of play. The prize? Control over the building blocks of our modern world. The conflict? It's a strategic showdown between China's current dominance and the West's desperate search for its own supply. The targets are those undervalued little miners ripe for a takeover. And the wild card in all of this is Brazil's incredible low-cost potential. If, and that is a very big if, it can clear all those hurdles.
Imagine this. A company could be sitting on a literal treasure trove of minerals and still be on the verge of going bust. Why? Because in this game, the old rules are out the window. It's not about what you've got in the ground anymore. Nope. It's all about what's written on paper.
Well, here's the kicker. The answer isn't buried in the dirt with all those valuable minerals. Not at all. It's hiding in plain sight, right there in the fine print. We're talking contracts, complex financial agreements, and yeah, a whole lot of government policy. In this new world, the money, it follows the paper trail, not the rock samples. Okay, so to really get this, we've got to dissect what a modern rare earth steel actually looks like. Let's peel back the layers and see what makes an agreement rock solid versus what makes it a one-way ticket to bankruptcy.
And this table, wow, it just lays it all out so perfectly. Take a look. On one side, you've got the heavy hitters, right? MP Materials and Linus. They've got these ironclad binding contracts with massive players. We're talking GM, Apple, even the US Department of Defense. That makes them super bankable. Lenders love them. But then, look at the other side. You've got a company like VHM. Their big deal fell through, and now 100% of their future output is just up in the air. For a bank, that's a huge red flag. Their project's bankability drops to pretty much zero.
So, what does bankable even mean? What do the money people actually want to see? Well, it really boils down to a couple of key things. First, they want what are called take-or-pay contracts. And it's just like it sounds, the buyer has to pay you for the stuff, period, even if they don't end up needing it. Then you've got floor price mechanisms, which basically protect you if the market tanks. And then there are the real game changers, like huge prepayments. You know, Apple gave MP Materials $500 million up front. That's basically a giant zero-interest loan. But the ultimate seal of approval? The top-tier guarantee? Having a government on your side, like the DoD.
And this quote from the source material just hits the nail on the head. It explains why all those flashy announcements about partnerships don't always mean much. It says, a memorandum of understanding, an MOU, is effectively worthless for debt financing. Think about it. An MOU is kind of like a handshake agreement. It looks great in a press release, but when you go to the bank asking for a few $100 million, they'll just laugh. They need to see a real solid commitment, signed in ink.
Okay, so we've seen how this works for individual companies. Now let's zoom out and look at the big picture, because what's happening here is a massive shift that's literally splitting the entire industry in two. This is what we're calling the Great Divide. And here's the headline, the most important thing to understand. The whole idea of one big, happy global market for rare earths, where everybody plays by the same rules, yeah, that's over. It's gone. The system has completely fractured. So now, the market really exists in two parallel universes. On one side, you have what's called the commercial sphere. Think of this as China's home turf. It's totally dominated by them, running on subsidized costs and a history of, let's be honest, predatory acquisitions. If you're a Western company trying to compete on price in that world, good luck. It's almost impossible. But then, this other world is popping up, the strategic sphere. This is a whole different ballgame. It's an ecosystem basically guaranteed by governments. Survival here isn't about being the cheapest. It's about being important enough for the state to back you up with things like price floors and special financing.
And here's the cold, hard truth of this new reality. If you're a smaller Western mining company and you try to play in that commercial sphere without any government help, you're basically toast. You're facing a massive risk of either going bankrupt or, and this is the truly ironic part, getting bought out by the very Chinese giants you were created to compete against.
So, if you're in that protected, strategic world, how do you survive? Well, that brings us to the ultimate insurance policy. It's the key survival mechanism in this new game. and it's called the sovereign put option.
Okay, so what on earth is a sovereign put option? Let's break it down. Think of it as a government guarantee. It's a signal, sometimes spoken aloud and sometimes just understood, that a company is simply too important to national security to be allowed to fail. Suddenly, your survival isn't about your profit margins anymore, it's about your strategic value. It is, quite literally, a geopolitical safety net.
And you can see how this just completely changes the entire economic equation, right? For a company like MP Materials or Lynas, staying in business isn't just a matter of balancing the books. Their solvency is actively propped up by government intervention. The only reason they can survive and even grow is because they live inside this protected bubble, this strategic sphere.
And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. This is real. Here's a hard number for you. $110 per kilogram. That's the price floor the US Department of Defense has set for a critical rare earth called NPDR. This is the safety net in action. It's the government stepping in and saying the price will not fall below this line, guaranteeing that its chosen suppliers can stay afloat.
So as we bring this all together, we get to the final equation. And it's a simple one, really. The game has changed. It's no longer about geology. It's all about geopolitics.
And if there's one thing you take away from this, let it be this. The West doesn't have a problem with the lack of minerals in the ground. It has a money problem. Specifically, private capital, Wall Street, is just not willing to fund these massive, decade-long projects by themselves. The risk is just too high. They refuse to bridge that funding gap unless a government comes in and de-risks the whole thing for them.
So for anyone watching this, for any investor trying to figure out this space, you gotta throw out the old rulebook. It's useless now. First, you have to look past the geology reports and really dig into the quality of the company's contracts. Second, you have to figure out which universe they're living in. Are they slugging it out in that brutal commercial sphere, or are they safe inside the strategic sphere? You've got to search for the evidence of that sovereign put option. Because the bottom line, the new reality, is this. In the world of rare earths, geopolitics now completely outweighs geology.
All of this leaves us with one last massive question to chew on. It's clear that Western governments have decided that having their own secure supply chain for these critical minerals is non-negotiable. But propping up an entire industry, creating this government-backed system, that doesn't come for free. So the question is, what's the real price of that security? And maybe more importantly, who is going to be the one to pay it?